All right. I know we're breaking with Church of Christ tradition by starting on time, but we got a lot of ground. We got a lot of ground to try to cover if we can. We're in Mark chapter 15. We're drawing to the close of this study on Mark, and so the beginning at that first verse of chapter 15 says, "Early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders, the scribes, and the whole council immediately held a consultation, and binding Jesus, they led him away and delivered him to Pilate." What had happened the night before, if you recall, Jesus was arrested. There was a huge group of the chief priests. They had some of the temple guard. They had even had some Roman soldiers. They went and arrested Jesus. They had two trials before daylight, which basically were, as my understanding, were illegal practices. Violated their own laws by having a trial at the home of Annas and one at Caiaphas. The Sanhedrin would not violate that, so they waited until daylight and gathered the whole group together. And if you recall, the Sanhedrin was a group of 70 men, plus at one point had been the high priest, but by the time Jesus came along, that was no longer in existence because they didn't trust the high priest anymore, and they would elect someone to be that 71st person. They they wanted to kill Jesus. This was their intent. They made no bones about it. They did not want it to happen, though. Their plan was not to have it during Passover, because they knew he had a huge following, and it would be could be a real problem. But Judas brought them this opportunity, and so here it was. But the Jews no longer had the authority to put anyone to death. Rome had done away with that, I think, a few years earlier than that. So they couldn't, even under their own law, they could not put anyone to death. So that's why they needed Pilate. They needed Pilate for two specific reasons. One, he was the only one that had the authority to put Jesus to death. And number two, by Pilate, if he's the one that puts Jesus to death, then it takes the situation out of their hands, and Pilate is much in a better position to quell any kind of uprising or protest that might come from the Jewish people. They can say, "Hey, this was Pilate's decision, and he has the personnel, he has the Roman soldiers where he can put this under control." So, a little history on Pilate. He was an appointed governor, and he was, I think he was in from AD 29 to 37. He did not have a good, he wasn't incompetent, but he was not able to be controlled by Rome. Couldn't be managed, and eventually that was his downfall. He had several encounters with the Jewish people where he would overreact to certain situations. He didn't like the Jews. He despised their leadership, and so he really kind of disdained them altogether. There was one situation where he put the emperor's image on some of the Jews' standards that they had a huge protest. They went to Caesarea and were protesting this because they considered this idolatry. He was going to have them all executed. And they volunteered to die. They opened up their cloaks and said, "Here we are. We would rather die than do this." So he changed his mind, took away the standard. There was another time where he raided the temple treasury, used that money to build an aqueduct to bring water in Jerusalem. That caused an uproar. There was another time where, that's even recorded in Scripture, where he killed some. There were some people who came to make sacrifices at the temple. There was some kind of situation arose, and many of these people were killed, and Pilate mixed their blood with the blood of the sacrifices.
And so eventually there was one situation, I don't remember what it was, where Rome said, okay, you're out of here. We can't deal with all of this stuff. So they bring Jesus to Pilate, and neither party likes each other. And right away, Pilate realizes this is really a scam. This guy has done nothing wrong. He's definitely not broken any Roman law. And he realizes that they have brought him to him because they are envious of him. And I read somewhere that that word envy, that Greek word envy that's mentioned of the Jewish leadership, it's the only time that word is used in the New Testament, and at least in the Gospels. And it means someone or a group of people who are jealous of someone's position or their authority or their status. So think about, what would the Jewish leadership be envious of Jesus? Why would they envy Jesus? What does he have that they don't have? They've got money, they've got authority, they've got prestige. But what do they not have that he has? He has the hearts of the people. Now, many of these people, Pharisees, they were sometimes respected because of their way of life, their righteousness. They were respected because of their knowledge of the Scriptures, but they weren't loved. They weren't loved. They didn't have the hearts of the people. Jesus had that, and I think that's one of the reasons. There's others, but I think Jesus had the hearts of the people. So they bring Jesus to Pilate, and Roman authorities would begin their days very, very early. Okay, how many morning people do we have here in the room? Okay, yeah, there's some of us, we're up, we get our day going, try to get, before the phone starts ringing, we try to get things done. That's the way the Roman authorities were. And so you get the idea that the Sanhedrin they can't wait for Pilate so they can get this thing going. So Matthew records an interesting story of where Pilate's wife sends a message to him. Don't have anything to do with this righteous man. I've had a dream about this. And that has always kind of bugged me. Say, okay, what kind of dream did she have? Where did that come from? Did she know Jesus? Did she have some kind of connection with him? The Greeks placed a lot of emphasis on dreams. If you had a dream, then there was supposed to be some type of special significance, importance with that. So we don't know. But she does send a message. She would not have been allowed to be there at the court, but she sends a message to Pilate. Don't have anything to do with this guy. I used to read that and think, well, she is very sympathetic towards Jesus. I don't really think that was the case. I think she was just trying to say to Pilate, you don't need this kind of situation. Have you ever had a case you really didn't want to take, Mitch? You just like, I don't want this. Let's see if I can find somebody else. Find Shannara or somebody else. He seems to want a lot. I was like, let him take it. So she, I think, is trying to tell Pilate, this is a no-win situation. Don't do this. And Pilate is kind of between a rock and a hard place. He's already had negative encounters with the Jewish leadership. According to secular records, there's been at least, I think, 2 occasions where they have gone over his head to Rome to try to say, complain about something. So he has a delicate situation where he has to have everything under control, while keeping, Rome happy, but he also has to keep the Jews happy. So, because of what his wife has said, he's trying to, as you read through Mark and some of the other accounts, he's trying to find a way to
not execute Jesus, but make the Jews happy. And there's no way that's going to happen. When he finds out that Jesus is from Galilee, that's when he sends him off to Herod. It's like, okay, I can send him to Herod. Herod will deal with it. I won't have to mess with it. But unfortunately, it gets punted back to him, and he has to deal with it. He has these conversations with Jesus. Says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Yes. And at this point, you know, the chief priests and all these people are making all these accusations against Jesus. And he doesn't say anything. He remains silent. Doesn't say a word. Even though the things that they're accusing him of are not true, he doesn't defend himself. Why? Mitch, why would someone, if they're being accused of something that is not true, why would they not say anything?
Because there's a greater goal, a greater purpose. He's fulfilling Isaiah's prophecy.
Absolutely.
He's like a lamb.
Yeah. He's going there. This is why he came. So trying to defend himself and get out of the situation is not why he's there. So he's not going to say anything. Does it make sense to Pilate? Why would you allow these people to accuse you of things that are not true? Because, like he said, I've got a much bigger mission. This is what I came to do. I'm not going to try to get out of it. I'm going to do what I came here to do. So he tries all sorts of things. He brings Barabbas out because he had a custom where at Passover he would pardon some criminal, someone who's in jail. So he brings out Barabbas, which is a huge difference in who these two people are. Barabbas was an insurrectionist. Barabbas was guilty of murder. So you got him over on one side and you've got Jesus. So he says, okay, which one do you want me to release? Barabbas. Okay. So what do I do with Jesus? Crucify him. But he hasn't done anything wrong. And then this shout just continues and continues. Now, what is also puzzling is how could Jesus on Sunday of that week come into Jerusalem, people shouting all sorts of things in his honor, laying down palm branches, laying down coats, ready to worship him, and then on Friday morning, they want to crucify him. How's that possible? You want me to tell you? No, go ahead, Mitch.
Well, some people say a lot of the people that were shouting Hosanna, and a lot of people who were shouting Hosanna and blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, they weren't there.
That's it.
They were the working folk. They were getting ready for Passover, Benji. They were out doing everything and trying to make a living, and all these folks are coming into Jerusalem for the Passover.
Yep.
This was not an easy time for people to get together and go hang out with Pilate and deal with the trial that early in the morning too.
The people who were doing the shouting on Thursday night of Passover, they're up late at night. They're up midnight, maybe even later. So at daylight, they're asleep. More like it, they're asleep. They're out in the countryside because there would not have been room for all these people. You can bet your bottom dollar that the Jewish leadership had handpicked who they wanted to be there that morning. And the people who were shouting, "Crucify him," were not the ones who were there shouting, "Hosanna." There's no way that's the same group of people. They had handpicked who they wanted. They went through there, and it just kind of gives you, this place where it says, it kind of gives you the impression, at the right time, this is what you're supposed to say. It was an organized mob. They had what they wanted. They had it choreographed the way they wanted it, and when the time's right, you start doing it. Pilate tries to, again, wash it. He says, okay, I'm washing my hands. I'm innocent of this guy's blood. This is all on you. And that famous statement, his blood be on us and our children, came back to haunt them back in 70 AD when the Romans came in. It's interesting, too, also that later when, after Pentecost and the church is established and the Sanhedrin
has conflicts with the apostles. They say, well, at least on one occasion, you're trying to put the blood of this man on us. And when I read that, I want to say, no, you've already done that. They're only doing what you said you wanted to happen. We'll take this on. So Pilate says, okay. Because I think in the back of his mind, Pilate was politically savvy in some ways. He's thinking, okay, this guy hasn't done anything wrong right now. He's innocent. But if he does have a huge following of people, and it turns into something other than what I think it is, and things kind of blow up in my face, these guys here are going to tell Rome, hey, we tried to warn you. We tried to tell Pilate, and he wouldn't listen to us. So he's thinking, okay, I'd rather crucify this innocent guy than have to deal with that. So he sends him off for the scourging and the crucifixion. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because you can find a lot of this, but in 1986 I came across an article that was a review of an article in, of all places, the Journal of the American Medical Association. How many medical people we got here? Nurses, who we got? Anybody? Well, it was interesting that I forgot what year it was, 83, 84, there was an article in the Journal of the American Medical Association by 3 doctors. And they had researched a Roman crucifixion, and then they actually went through the scriptures about the crucifixion of Jesus, and they kind of detailed physically, they didn't get into any theology, but they went through physically what a person would go through, and specifically Jesus, what would go through during the scourging and the crucifixion. And at that time, I had a friend who was working at a hospital, and he pulled up that article and made copies of it for me. And so I wanted to read through it, and I had to put it down a couple of times because I had never read in detail exactly what happened. The scourging was incredible, where you had a whip with leather straps on it and pieces of metal and bone, and they would usually tie your hands around a post or something to get the skin tight, and they would just beat you as long as they wanted to. There was no restriction. The main thing was they didn't want to kill you because they wanted to crucify you. At sometimes bones would be, internal organs would be exposed through it. It was brutal. There's a passage, I think, in 1 Peter that is interesting, that where Peter, I think it's Peter who says, by his wound, singular, we were healed. And some think that Peter is making a reference that the beating of Jesus was so severe, it wasn't like he had a lot of wounds. It was just one big, massive wound on his back. At that point, Jesus, they put a purple robe on him. The Roman soldiers began to mock him, put a crown of thorns on his head, and they would bow down, and they would make fun of him. They would hit him. They would take a rod and hit him on the head, driving those thorns into his skull. And then, at that point, according to custom, the person would have to carry their cross to the point of execution. And there's all kinds of debate about, okay, what did the cross look like? What was it like? You know, if you watch the movies, most of the time it's a situation like this, and they carry the whole thing out to the execution. And that's probably not accurate. You know, the Romans performed crucifixions quite frequently. And most of the stuff that I have read is there would be a vertical piece that was in the ground all the time. And the condemned person would have to carry the cross piece on their shoulders to the place of execution. There would be someone usually walking in front of them with a placard that had their name, what their crime was, and they would make them march through the busiest part of the city, wherever they were at the time, to try to, again, humiliate him as much as possible. So you'd be taken to the point of execution, lay you on the ground, nail you your hands, which the Romans had discovered through trial and error that nailing through the palm of the hand didn't work. So they'd go just above the wrist and go in between those two bones that were there and drive the nail through there. And when it hit those nerves, it would make your hand draw up into like a claw. And they would lift you then and mount you into the vertical part. Usually 1 foot over, they'd nail your feet into that vertical part. It wasn't way up in the air. It was, just pretty much, almost normal height usually. And no one could come near you and touch you, but the Romans would allow people to come up and get, maybe as close as this camera, and they could say anything they wanted to. And it tells us that the chief priests and these people would come up, and it said they hurled insults at him, wagging their heads. This was a custom in the culture at that time that if you insulted someone and wagged your head, it was an ultimate insult. Something about shaking your head was an ultimate form of disdain, disgust. And so they did that, and they, said, well, there's a place where this, verse 31 says, in the same way the chief priests also along with the scribes were mocking him among themselves, saying, he saved others, he cannot save himself. Let this Christ, the King of Israel, now come down from the cross so that we may see and believe. Now, when I read that, Wiley, I know when they were, I never bought one of those wristbands that said, what would Jesus do? Not because I didn't think it was a bad thing, but I have no idea what Jesus would do. I know what Peter would do, probably, and what James and John would do. Peter would try to take your head off with a sword, and James and John would call down fire from heaven to burn you up. I can relate to that. I can't relate to how Jesus would do things. But every time I would read this, Mitch, this is where I would want Jesus to come off the cross and just say, here I am. Would they have believed? No. No. There's an old saying that says, if I see it, I'll believe it. Show me, I'll believe it. It didn't apply with these guys. They had seen enough to know that Jesus was the Son of God. They saw it. They knew the Scriptures. They were not going to believe. But the point here is it was an incredible humiliation, mockery, what Jesus went through. In Mark's gospel, more than the other three, he doesn't deal as much with some of the graphics of the crucifixion as he does with the humiliation and the mockery that went on. And many think that it's because of who Mark was writing his letter to. If you remember, Mark is writing, his letter would have been written, they think, his account probably around 60 AD. And this was at the height of Nero's reign in Rome. Christians were being persecuted. So when Mark writes his gospel account, he's accurate, but he doesn't portray Rome in the same way that Matthew, Luke, and John do. And many think it's because Mark wants to make sure they know what happened, but his concern would have been that things are already bad enough for the Christians who are there. If Mark really brings the hammer down on the Romans, the persecution could be even worse. So he's accurate, but he wants to show to the people there that the Jewish leadership are the ones that got this ball rolling. He wants to make sure they understand that. And so Jesus is there, he's crucified, and again, it's a very brutal situation. Interesting enough, this article from that medical article said that most people died. Interestingly, many of them died from suffocation. I read that. How in the world do you suffocate and you're out in the open like that? And they said the way the Romans had discovered that, the way they put you on the cross, that you had so much weight coming on your diaphragm you couldn't exhale. So the only way you could continue to breathe, you had to push up and stand up on that one nail in your 2 feet so you could breathe in and out. And then when you couldn't stand that pain any longer, then you would drop back down. And it was just a continuous up and down. But according to secular records, there were some people who survived 2 and 3 days before they died. And it's just hard to imagine being able to do that you could survive this for that length of time. But it says then that Jesus, there was darkness. Verse 33 says, when the 6th hour came, darkness fell over the whole land until the 9th hour. Now, this was, as I understand it, total darkness. Some people have tried to say this was an eclipse. There was some kind of sandstorm, but none of that really. This was a miraculous event, as far as I understand. The way I look at it is a miraculous event. But there's an interesting, I think, object lesson in this. All right, 3 hours of darkness before Jesus dies. Now, the Jews would have, we think, would have made a real connection with this, with the darkness. When is this crucifixion taking place? Passover. What is Passover? What is that supposed to? Supposed to remember when the 10th plague came on Egypt, and the death angel came through and killed the firstborn male, man and animal, in every situation. What was the 9th plague before the 10th one? Darkness. 3 days. So if you're a Jew and you know your stuff, you're starting to think, okay, in Egypt, you had darkness. Then you had the 10th plague, death of the firstborn male. We have, at Passover, we have 3 hours of darkness before the firstborn, the only Son of God, who's going to die. And then judgment's coming. Pretty powerful picture there of what is going on. So Jesus then, it says at the 9th hour, he cried out with a loud voice, my God, why have you forsaken me? Verse 37, and Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. Now, I think it's important to understand that, in a sense, the Romans did not kill Jesus. He gave up. He died when he wanted to. Yes, they crucified him. They were that. But he didn't die of suffocation. He didn't die of blood loss. He died when he wanted to. If you remember, he made a statement during his ministry. He says, no one takes my life. I lay it down and I'll take it up. But why was it so important that he die at the 9th hour at 3 o'clock in the afternoon? Because every day at 3 o'clock, there was a sacrifice in the temple. It was a lamb would be sacrificed to God. The idea of saying, God, remember the promises that you've made to us. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, there would be a priest with a lamb with a knife to his throat, ready to kill it. Somewhere in the temple area, there was another one who was watching either a sundial or an hourglass to see when it was 3 o'clock. There was another one on a pinnacle somewhere high on the temple with a shofar, a horn. And when it got 3 o'clock and he gave the signal,
the throat would be cut and the horn would be blown. And anybody in the temple area who heard that knew that lamb was being crucified. So Jesus died at the same time this lamb was killed. Jesus died signifying that this is not going to be needed anymore. The perfect lamb, the one that John the Baptist says, there goes the Lamb of God. There was another thing that happened, and that was where the curtain of the temple was torn from top to bottom. And there's debate about which curtain it is because there was two curtains in the temple. I've always felt that it was the curtain that separated the holy place from the most holy place, which symbolized the fact that now we don't need a priest, we don't need anybody to have access to God for us. All of us, any of us, have access to God. But also, it kind of signifies that unlike the mentality that the Sadducees and some of the others had, God is not in a box somewhere. He's not there. He is now out and open to all of us. But the thing that I love the most about this is when the centurion was there, verse 39, when the centurion who was standing right in front of him saw the way he breathed his last, truly this was the Son of God. Now some have tried to say, well, he wasn't really saying that. He was saying this was the Son of a God or a Son of God. But everything that I've read says, no, this is what he said. This was the Son of God. And you might think, how could a Roman soldier, a Roman centurion, have that kind of perception? Well, if you recall, in the Gospels, every time there is a incident involving a centurion, it's always positive. Jesus had a centurion come to him, and he's got someone that's sick. He says, I'll come to your house. He said, no. You can just say the word, and it'll be done. And Jesus said, I haven't seen this kind of faith in Israel by anybody. Yes, ma'am.
I wanted to ask a question. It goes back to Pilate and his thinking.
Okay.
Says that, in 19 verse 7, the Jews insisted we have a law, and according to that law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God. When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace. Where do you come from? He asked Jesus. But Jesus gave him no answer. Do you refuse to speak to me? Pilate said. Don't you realize I have power to either to free you or crucify you? And Jesus answered, you would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Do you think that Pilate felt he was between a rock and a hard place? Maybe he felt like Jesus was a higher power. Could it be that surely Pilate had heard of the miracles that Jesus had performed?
Not necessarily. No, it's important to know that the governors did not live in Jerusalem. They lived in Caesarea. The governors, the traditional would have been in Caesarea. About the only time they came into Jerusalem would be on big festivals when they had to make sure they were going to be in control of things. But especially Pilate, he despised them so much that he stayed in Caesarea as much as possible. He would only come to Jerusalem if he absolutely had to. As far as the rock and a hard place, yeah. Now, I don't think he saw Jesus as, in my opinion, Nancy, as a higher power. I think he looked at Jesus as somebody the Jews hated, someone who was maybe misguided, somebody who was trying to build up a following. But I don't think Pilate looked at him as being something as far as being a son of God, being somebody like that. I don't think he thought that way. I don't think he knew enough about Jesus to think that. He was just some guy, some innocent guy the Jews have brought in who they see as a threat to their
position, their authority, and they want to get rid of him. I think he saw him that he was innocent, but I think he also saw that there was the potential that he could have a following that could be detrimental, that could cause him problems. So the rock and the hard place is he doesn't want to kill an innocent man necessarily. I mean, he could. He had the authority to do it. So he's got that, but he also doesn't want to have these guys going over his head to Rome and causing more problems, because he's already probably on his last bit of compassion from Rome and be able to keep his position. Does that answer? Sort of. All right, what part tell me what you're thinking. I want to.
He's already told him, don't have anything to do with this man. This is just one phrase in here that I question. Why is he? Pilate seems to be afraid at everything at this point. So,
well, yeah. Now, on that part, Nancy, yeah, I think Pilate, because of his history, because of all the he's gotten all kinds of warnings from Rome, don't mess up again.
Yeah, I can understand the political part.
Yeah.
But it just seems like to me he's questioning here.
And it
anyway,
could, and
that's my thought.
okay, and it could be. Anybody else? Okay, so Jesus gives up his life. He dies, and then we get to verse 42. When evening had already come, because it was the preparation day, that is, the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea came, a prominent member of the council, who himself was waiting for the kingdom of God, and he gathered up courage and went in before Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Pilate wondered if he was dead by this time, and summoning the centurion, he questioned him as to whether he was already dead. And ascertaining this from the centurion, he granted the body to Joseph. It's interesting that this guy, Joseph of Arimathea, when you read all of the other gospel accounts, we find out that he was a wealthy man. He was a part of the Sanhedrin. He did not give his consent to what they did, what their decision was. And he had been a disciple, it says. He was a disciple of Jesus, but he had done so in secret because of fear of the Jews. So here's a guy along with Nicodemus. You remember Nicodemus is the Pharisee that came to see Jesus at night. You have Nicodemus, who was a believer. He believed that Jesus was the Son of God. In my mind, I think that's what he thought. And Joseph of Arimathea has become a disciple of Jesus, and I think he believes the same thing. But they do so secretly because of fear. But at this point here, it's like, okay, all bets are off. I am not going to allow Jesus to have the kind of burial that he would have. Normally, when someone was crucified, unless they had family, the bodies would just be taken down, sometimes just dumped in a common grave, but they certainly didn't get a proper burial. And Joseph of Arimathea was going to make sure that didn't happen. And this had to be planned ahead of time. This had to be planned. So somehow, we don't know, scriptures don't tell us, but I believe somehow that Jesus and Joseph, and maybe even Nicodemus, planned for this to take place, because there was a tomb available right there at the crucifixion site. And someone of the status of Joseph would not have ever wanted to be buried at a place like that. He would have had a tomb somewhere else with his family. So I think he purchased it. I think he had it ready because they knew they would not have much time to give him a proper burial. If he died at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they got to get the body down. They've got to get it prepped, which in that culture means you had to clean the body. And Jesus' body would have been in a miserable shape, so they'd have to clean the body. Then they've got to wrap it with linen, and as you wrap it with linen, you put spices in there to help kind of cover up the smell of the decomposition. And is that a real word? Did I just decompose it? Is that decompose maybe, anyhow. So this had to be planned. They had to have everything ready because they had a short amount of time to do that because it had to be done before Sabbath began. And what this meant for Joseph and for Nicodemus, by touching a dead body, they have made themselves ceremonially unclean, which means they cannot celebrate the Sabbath. They can't do that. But they were willing to do it. And it says that Joseph gathered his courage to go see Pilate. You know, you didn't just go see Pilate for any reason. And Pilate was already irritated, aggravated by the Jewish leadership, and Joseph is coming as a part of that. He is a part of that group. He is a part of the Sanhedrin. But he goes there because I'm going to make sure Jesus gets a proper burial. And so he comes out and they do that, and they put Jesus in that tomb. We can read into this different things, but I think Joseph knew, maybe Joseph and Nicodemus knew, he's not going to need that tomb very long. And they put him in there, they put the stone over it, and then next week Roxy gets to tell you about the resurrection. Now somehow, Roxy, I've gotten a bad draw here lately. I had to talk about the destruction of Jerusalem. Now I've talked about crucifixion. You always get to follow up with the good stuff. So I'm not sure how that worked out. But I believe firmly that Joseph and Nicodemus doesn't tell us, and I tried to find some type of history about it. But once the Sanhedrin knew what they did, I think that was over for them. I think they no longer would have had any status with the Sanhedrin because they had defiled themselves by touching the body of the man that they had helped crucify. But they decided it doesn't make any difference. This is what we believe, and we're going to step out there. Regardless of what it costs us at this point, we're going to do it. All right. I know I went pretty. Got a minute? Any questions? Yes.
Was not able to understand why they beat Jesus so severely before he was taken to the cross, how he even made it without dying then before they were able to take him to the cross.
Well, a lot of people did. Coach, a lot of people never survived. In their sick mind, the purpose was to create as much blood loss and pain as they could before the crucifixion. It was just the Roman mentality. Part of it is, I think if they didn't do that, then the person would linger on the cross for a much longer period of time. So the more severe usually the scourging was, then the shorter the time would be that they'd actually be on the cross. And that four-man guard had to stay there until that person died. So,
Benji?
Yes.
While I think that your earlier analysis that perhaps those that were calling for Jesus to be crucified were not the same ones on the road from the triumphal entry, I think the overwhelming caution throughout this entire chapter is to be careful who you listen to.
Oh yeah.
And to be wary of following the crowd or following what is expedient at the time. Whether that be from the previous chapter of Peter's denial when faced with situations that were uncomfortable, or whether it says, the teachers of the law stirred up the crowd, and you can see that happening. And how many times have we seen in our own culture the crowd mentality taking over and people doing things that they would not normally do? So to me, there's an overwhelming caution there of be careful who you listen to.
Yeah. Well, if you remember also, later on, when the Apostle Paul was in Ephesus, one of the most humorous passages in the New Testament, where they were complaining about the fact that they were preaching against idols and that they had stirred up.
and there was a amphitheater in Ephesus that would seat like 25,000 people. So all these people are coming into that place, and their passage is there. It says they would get there and they didn't even know why they were there. It was like everybody shouting, and it's like, okay, why are we here? Well, I thought you knew. No. They just followed the crowd and were screaming and hollering, and they had no idea why they were there. So yes, we have to be careful in anything, whether it's political or spiritual or whatever. Careful who we get, who we follow, who we listen to, because we can make some serious mistakes there. Anything else? All right, our time's up. Thank you.